It was precisely 9:15 on the morning of the 29th of September 2025, when the double oak doors of the King's private study at Clarence House opened, and King Charles walked into the room that would contain the most consequential words he had spoken since the death of his mother. The air inside that study did not merely feel cold. It felt heavy in the particular way of spaces where something irrevocable is about to occur and where everyone present already knows it. Outside, London went about its business with the usual indifferent energy of a city that has witnessed the rise and fall of enough kings to have stopped being surprised by either. Tourists photographed the stoic guards. The streets hummed with the morning's commerce. And behind those oak doors, in a room containing no cameras, no press secretaries, and no trace of the pageantry that the monarchy deploys to manage the world's perception of its internal life, a silence had fallen that those present have since described in identical terms. It felt, one advisor said, like the heartbeat of the monarchy itself had skipped. This was not a scheduled meeting. It had been convened in such absolute secrecy that not a single royal correspondent, not one of the seasoned court watchers whose professional lives are devoted to detecting precisely these kinds of gatherings, had received even the faintest whisper of its existence. The faces of the king's closest legal advisors were drained of color. Two senior courtiers who had between them navigated decades of royal crisis looked, by the accounts of those who observed them, as though they had aged overnight. The private secretary stood at the head of the mahogany table with white-knuckled hands clutching a leather folder marked in jarring red letters, "Confidential Domestic Action." Before we begin today's royal update, I want to take a quick moment. Many of you watch these videos but haven't subscribed yet, and you don't want to miss the latest developments and fascinating stories from the world of royalty. Subscribing is completely free and keeps you updated as everything unfolds. While you're here, tell us, where are you watching from? Share it in the comments. It's amazing to see viewers joining us from all around the world. Then Charles sat down, and those who had spent years in proximity to this man, who had watched him perform the dignified composure of sovereignty across coronations and state funerals, and the full ceremonial weight of a reign inherited under the most scrutinized circumstances in modern royal history, understood immediately that what they were looking at was not that man. His hands shook with a visibility that he could not control and did not attempt to hide, lacing his fingers together on the table's surface in the particular gesture of someone trying to contain a trembling they are not accustomed to experiencing. His eyes, rimmed with the red of what looked like days of exhaustion and something rawer and more personal, could barely meet the gaze of the advisors he had trusted for the better part of his adult life. When he finally spoke, his voice did not carry the resonant authority that those present had heard in 1,000 official settings. It cracked. It was the sound of a man on the precise edge of a collapse he was still, through sheer force of will and decades of training, preventing himself from completing. He looked at the men across the table, and he whispered words that detonated in that room with the particular force of things that cannot be taken back. "I intend to separate from Queen Camilla." To understand the full magnitude of what those 7 words meant, one must understand what had preceded them across 30 years of one of the most scrutinized and most criticized relationships in modern royal history. Charles had not merely loved this woman, he had staked everything on her. He had risked his reputation and his relationship with his mother and the public goodwill that a future monarch requires to function with any effectiveness. Across years of sustained hostility from a British public that had adored Diana and had transferred a significant portion of that adoration's inverse onto the woman they blamed for the marriage's failure. He had defended Camilla in private and in public, and through the sustained pressure of years of institutional disapproval, with the particular tenacity of someone who has decided that this is the battle that defines them, and who has never, through any of it, shown the slightest sign of reconsidering. And now, at the absolute pinnacle of the journey that defense had been building toward, with Camilla seated as queen consort in the position that everything he had been sacrificed to achieve, he was sitting in that study with shaking hands and a cracking voice, saying the words that dismantled 30 years of conviction in 7 syllables. The file that had broken him was not what his advisors had feared it might be, when the intelligence report first arrived on his desk 8 days before the emergency session. It was not an affair. It was not a financial scandal of the kind that the tabloid press periodically attempted to construct from the thinnest available material. It was something that those who have read it in full describe as more insidious than either of those things and more damaging in a specific and personal way that the other categories of royal crisis are not. The dossier detailed a sophisticated and sustained campaign of strategic media manipulation linked directly to the Queen's inner circle. For years, Charles had operated on the foundational assumption that he and Camilla were a united front against the relentless scrutiny of the press, two people who had survived the worst that public opinion could produce and had emerged, however battered, together. What the intelligence report described was something that shattered that assumption at its foundation. Strategic leaks had been orchestrated, with a consistency and a coordination that the report's authors were careful to characterize as deliberate rather than coincidental, to elevate the Queen's public image at the direct expense of other members of the royal family, members who included the King's sons, members who included, on specific documented occasions, the King himself. It was manipulation wearing the clothing of loyalty. And for a man who values the institution above his own comfort and the trust of his inner circle above almost everything else, it was the specific kind of betrayal that does not produce anger in its first impact. It produces the particular devastation of a belief system whose foundational premise has just been proven false. The King had believed he was not alone in that marriage. The file told him he had been more alone than he knew. Virginia Giuffa had spent more than 2 decades fighting to be heard by institutions that had every structural incentive to ensure she was not. She had navigated the legal machinery of a system whose relationship with the powerful men she was accusing was considerably more intimate than its relationship with her. She had endured the particular cruelty of public disbelief directed at accusers whose stories implicate people whose prominence makes the stories inconvenient. She had watched settlements reached and documents sealed, and the slow, grinding process of accountability deferred by wealth and influence, and the particular resilience of powerful men who have learned that time is their most effective legal instrument. She took her own life in April of 2025 without having seen the full accounting she had spent years pursuing. What she left behind was a manuscript. And what that manuscript did, when it was released to a world that had been following the edges of her story for years without ever seeing its center, was something that no legal proceeding and no official settlement had managed to accomplish. It told the truth in her own words, without the filtering of legal counsel or the strategic management of a press team. And it did so with the specific and unvarnished authenticity of someone who had written knowing she would not be present to defend or elaborate upon what she had set down. Nobody's Girl was released in October of 2025, and it did not merely climb the bestseller charts. It obliterated them. The #1 position on Amazon globally was secured before the official release date by a volume of pre-orders that publishing sources described as unlike anything they had seen for a non-fiction title in the preceding decade. The public hunger for what the book contained was not prurient. It was the hunger of people who had been following a story whose most important chapter had been withheld from them for years and who understood, from the scale of what had already been publicly established, that what remained undisclosed was the part that mattered most. What they found inside the pages confirmed that instinct with a thoroughness that left the palace with no defensive position it had not already abandoned. Virginia's account of Prince Andrew was specific in the way that fabricated accounts never managed to be. The 3 occasions, her age, the Maxwell introduction at the London house where a woman had leaned in and whispered to a 17-year-old girl that she was going to meet a handsome prince that night, deploying the language of fairy tale to frame something whose reality was its precise opposite. The detail that sources describe as the single most devastating passage in the entire memoir was the one in which Virginia recounted Andrew's acknowledgement of her age, not with the alarm or the immediate withdrawal that such an acknowledgement might be expected to produce in a man of ordinary moral instinct, but with the particular casualness of someone for whom the information registered as a data point rather than a boundary. He had mentioned, Virginia wrote, that his own daughters were only slightly younger than she was. That single documented detail accomplished something that years of legal argument and public debate had not. It showed not merely what Andrew had done, but what he had felt while doing it, which was, by every account Virginia provided, very little. The palace's response to the memoir's imminent publication had been preceded by Andrew's own preemptive move, a carefully worded statement announcing the voluntary relinquishment of his Duke of York title 4 days before the book hit shelves. It was presented as an act of duty. The public received it as what it was, a calculation. The gesture of a man who has assessed the incoming damage and determined that a voluntary sacrifice of something already largely ceremonial might be sufficient to protect what remained. It was not sufficient. It did not come close. The memoir had not been written to respond to gestures. It had been written to establish a record. And the record it established made Andrew's voluntary title relinquishment look not like contrition, but like confirmation that he understood the gravity of what was documented and had hoped that a preemptive concession might soften its impact. It did not soften it, it amplified it. Behind the scenes, the negotiation over Royal Lodge had reached a state that palace insiders described with consistent language. Siege. Andrew's demands, communicated through intermediaries to the king's legal team, reflected a man who had not yet processed the relationship between status and entitlement, the fundamental reality that the protections and provisions of royal life are not separable from the position that justifies them. A financial settlement whose upper figure sources placed at $99 million, a full-time staff funded by the Duchy of Lancaster, round-the-clock police protection at whatever residence he was relocated to, the demands of a man who had lost the title but expected to retain the lifestyle that the title had underwritten. Prince William's response to those demands, delivered to his father in the private meetings that sources describe as the most consequential conversations of the early reign, was not negotiation. It was ultimatum. Every day Andrew remained associated with the royal family in any meaningful sense was a day the institution communicated to the public that proximity to the crown provided protection from consequences. William had spent years watching that message corrode public support for an institution he would one day lead. He was not prepared to spend any more of them doing so. The Duchess of Kent's funeral on the 16th of September 2025 was constructed with the particular solemnity that the British royal family has refined across centuries of public grief into something approaching an art form. The procession moved with measured precision. The family arrived in layers of deepest black, their faces arranged in the composed expressions of people who understand that mourning in public is itself a form of duty and who have been performing that duty since childhood with a consistency that leaves no visible gap between the feeling and its presentation. Prince William walked with the steady gait of a man carrying institutional weight alongside personal grief. Princess Anne moved with her characteristic purposeful composure. For the hours of the formal ceremony, it seemed that the ancient rituals of the crown had provided what they were designed to provide. A structure within which the chaos of loss could be contained and dignified and presented to a watching public as evidence that the institution endures regardless of what it must endure. 7 seconds dismantled all of it. The clip was captured outside St. George's Chapel by a camera that had been positioned to document the family's departure and whose operator had not initially understood the significance of what the lens had caught. Andrew and Sarah Ferguson stood slightly apart from the main family grouping in the particular way of people who have learned through years of managed distance to position themselves at the edges of official gatherings. What the clip showed was Andrew's body language in those 7 seconds, the relaxed shoulders, the slight forward lean, the smile that moved across his features with the ease of genuine amusement, while the family surrounding him maintained the composed gravity that the setting demanded. He appeared, to the 2 million people who had viewed the clip by midnight of the same day, to be sharing a joke at a funeral, while wearing the face of a man who had not yet understood that the world was watching him with a patience that had finally run out. The public reaction was not measured, and it was not slow. Within hours, major newspapers had positioned the clip as the defining image of a man comprehensively disconnected from the reality of his own situation. The Guardian described it as a stunning lapse of judgment. The Telegraph called it an optical nightmare. Social media supplied its own verdict with the particular efficiency of a platform designed to collapse the distance between observation and judgment. "He is laughing at a funeral," read the caption on the post that reached the widest circulation, and that captured with 4 words what editorial columns required paragraphs to say. Within 48 hours, an emergency meeting had been convened at Clarence House. Present were the King, Prince William, and Princess Anne. The agenda was not housing. It was not titles. It was the question that the funeral clip had forced into the open in a way that no amount of palace management could redirect. What exactly had Andrew been saying in those 7 seconds? And to whom had he been saying similar things in the weeks and months that preceded them? The answer that the emergency meeting produced was the detail that sources describe as the true origin of the speed and the comprehensiveness of what followed. Andrew had been talking, not through official channels or managed statements, but in the private and increasingly indiscreet way of a man who had concluded that the knowledge he possessed gave him a form of protection, and who had begun deploying that knowledge in conversations whose participants had not remained as discreet as he had assumed they would. What he had disclosed touched directly on Meghan's past, specific information whose content sources have been consistent in declining to detail, but equally consistent in characterizing as the kind of disclosure that transforms a reputational liability into an institutional security threat. It had reached people it should never have reached. It had been framed in ways that were not neutral. And it had done so with a casualness that those who learned of it found more alarming than the disclosure itself, because the casualness indicated that this had not been a single lapse, but a pattern whose full extent remained unknown. William's response in that Clarence House meeting was described by those with knowledge of its contents as the moment the institutional calculation shifted from managing Andrew to removing him. He had brought evidence, not allegations and not characterizations, but documented evidence of what had been said and to whom and in what context. He placed it before his father without editorial commentary and waited. Charles, already broken by the Camilla dossier and the Virginia memoir and the accumulated weight of a month that had dismantled more of his foundational assumptions than any preceding period of his reign, looked at what his son had placed before him and made the decision that had been moving toward him across all of it. The meeting ended. The legal team was summoned. And the letters patent process that would formally and permanently strip Andrew of every remaining marker of his royal identity was initiated before the day was over. The Buckingham Palace statement, released on the 30th of October 2025, was brief in the particular way of documents whose authors understand that brevity is itself a form of severity. It did not elaborate. It did not contextualize. It did not offer the softening language that palace communications typically deploy when significant institutional decisions are being presented to a public whose emotional response requires management. It simply stated what had been decided and what it meant, and allowed the weight of both to land without assistance. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, not His Royal Highness, not the Duke of York, not any of the designations that had anchored his identity across 65 years of royal life. Just a name, stripped of every prefix and suffix that had given it its particular meaning within the architecture of the institution he had been born into and had spent his entire life inhabiting. The clinical efficiency of that erasure was not accidental. It was a message delivered in the language of institutional finality to every person carrying a Windsor connection who had been operating on the assumption that the blood relationship to a sovereign provided unconditional protection. That assumption was now demonstrably and permanently false. 5,000 miles away in the hills above Montecito, the statement arrived on screens inside a mansion whose carefully curated aesthetics spoke to a very specific vision of liberated royal life, the possibility of carrying the prestige of a royal connection without submitting to the institution that conferred it. Harry and Meghan had built something real and commercially significant in the 4 years since their departure from official royal duties: the Netflix partnership, the Archuel Foundation. The speaking engagements and the media appearances and the carefully managed public profile whose market value derived, in ways that neither of them had ever been required to formally quantify, but that their commercial advisors understood with complete precision, from the Sussex titles that remained attached to their names and that connected them, however tenuously and however contentiously, to a 1,000-year institution whose gravitational pull does not diminish simply because its beneficiaries have moved to California. The statement from Buckingham Palace did not mention them. It did not need to. What it established applied to them as directly and as uncomfortably as it applied to Andrew, and they understood that application within minutes of reading it. Meghan's response was described by sources close to the household with a consistency that suggests its essential character is not in dispute. It was not philosophical. It was not the measured assessment of someone processing a complex institutional development with the detachment of an observer rather than a participant. It was the immediate and visceral reaction of someone who has just understood that a threat they had categorized as theoretical has just been demonstrated to be entirely operational. "No one is taking my Duchess title away." The statement was made to friends rather than to the press, and it was made with an urgency that those who heard it recognized as something beyond defiance. It was the urgency of someone recalculating the foundations of a life whose structural assumptions have just shifted beneath them. The Sussex titles were not merely honorifics. They were the commercial and institutional infrastructure on which everything built in California rested. Without them, the Sussex brand did not diminish. It collapsed, and the Charles precedent had just proven that their removal was not merely possible, but that the institution had both the will and the mechanism to accomplish it. The specific information Andrew had disclosed about Meghan's past continued to circulate in ways that palace sources describe as requiring active containment well beyond the formal stripping of his titles. William had ensured that the institutional consequences for Andrew went beyond the public announcement into territory that sources characterize as the most comprehensive removal of royal protection ever applied to a living family member. But the disclosure itself could not be undone. The people who had received it had received it. The conversations in which it had featured had occurred. And the question of what those conversations had set in motion remained, in the weeks following the October 30th statement, the most actively monitored concern in William's private office. Not because of what had already happened, but because of what the pattern of Andrew's behavior suggested might happen next from a man who had lost everything institutional and retained only the knowledge that proximity to power had given him across a lifetime inside the firm. The Charles precedent settled over the extended Windsor family with the particular weight of something that cannot be unlearned. A reigning monarch had proven with a single statement that royal status was conditional, that the institution's tolerance had a defined and reachable limit, and that when that limit was reached, the response would be swift, comprehensive, and entirely indifferent to the personal cost to the individual whose conduct had necessitated it. In Montecito, the titles Duke and Duchess of Sussex had begun, in the days following the statement, to feel less like honors and more like exposure, less like the foundation of a life and more like the most visible target on it. The distance between California and London had always been part of the plan. What October 2025 had revealed was that it had never been part of the protection.